85 million casualties versus 16 million. World War II was the most disastrous conflict ever waged on Earth. But how was it many times more deadly than the previous World War? To understand the incredible loss of human life between the two world wars, it's important to know where fighting actually took place in both wars. World War I was so called because it involved all the major European powers who dragged their colonies into fighting along with them. It would have been more fair to simply call it Europe's Great War, but thanks to colonialism, everyone got invited to the party. Still, the vast majority of the fighting took place in Europe, and all the costliest battle of the war took place on the continent, and it was a brutal affair too. If you were a British soldier, you had about an 11% chance of never coming home again, but the scope of the heaviest fighting was really rather geographically limited. When World War II came around, the world was more interconnected than ever up to that point. This, by necessity, meant that fighting had to be more global. Defeating major European powers no longer meant keeping the war in Europe, while much of the fighting still took place on the continent. Africa saw a fair share of the fighting with the Axis push to cut the Allies off from the Middle Eastern and African oil. All along Northern Africa still remained rusted hulks of tanks and armored vehicles that clashed in massive battles, all in a bid to starve the Allies of precious oil. But this World War did not just include European players. Japan had invited itself into the chat, as its ambition to rule the Pacific put it on a collision course with the Allied European powers, who still maintained very lucrative colonies in the region. These colonies produced everything from food to all important rubber to once more oil, and Japan did not just want these resources for itself, it needed them. As an island nation, Japan is relatively resource poor and depends on importing vital resources from other nations. This meant that the West would always have a leash on Japan, preventing it from rising as a major power by keeping its ambitions in check by threatening trade embargoes. The launch of hostilities in Europe was the opportunity that Japan needed to take these lucrative colonies for itself, kick the West out of the Pacific, and establish the empire of the rising sun over Asia. Japan had already launched an invasion of China, which itself had been preoccupied with bitter infighting between the nationalists and the communists. The two sides temporarily set their differences aside and tried to repel the Japanese invaders, but Japan was better equipped and trained than the disheveled Chinese forces. China had, after all, just endured a century of humiliation where it was purposely weakened and exploited by European powers. Despite absolutely dwarfing Japan, it was in no position to resist imperial Japanese forces. China would provide much of the raw materials and manufacturing power that Japan needed to fuel its empire, but there was still one Western power who could ruin all of Japan's ambitions: the United States of America. The United States had maintained a strong Pacific presence for decades due to the area's importance of international trade. Despite being the world's fourth largest country, the United States had always been a maritime power. That's because of its unique position on the face of the earth. It is the most important nation between the Atlantic and the Pacific, making it the balancing point between Europe and the Asian powers. But US national security strategy hinged on being a powerful maritime power, and the nation was committed to tolerating zero incursion into its hemisphere of the earth from other major powers, European or Asian. By the time that the Second World War rolled around, the United States Navy was rivaling the vaunted Royal Navy, with the express purpose of ensuring that conflict was always far from home. Much of this firepower was stationed in its Pacific, where the United States was keeping a very close eye on Japan. Japanese expansionism had seriously disrupted US trade in the region, and relations between the two powers was strained at best. The US held the superior strategic position, with all its forces capable of defending all important Pacific rubber plantations and oil fields. Japan was also heavily reliant on American oil and industrial exports, and as long as these remained the status quo, the US would always hold the leash on Japanese ascension. Thus, in December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy struck Pearl Harbor in a bid to inflict catastrophic losses on the US Navy and keep it out of the Pacific for good. At the same time, it launched an invasion of the American-held Philippines, looking to ensure that the US had no base of operations in the region from which to counterattack. The addition of the Pacific theater had just made the Second World War the first truly global conflict, and now fighting raged across the entire face of the planet. In the Pacific alone, it is estimated that there were about 25 million casualties, more than the total casualties of the World War. Only 6 million of these casualties were combatants. The rest, a whopping 19 million, were civilians. While both sides targeted civilians, with the Chinese and allies inflicting an estimated 1.2 million civilian casualties on Japan, the Japanese Empire killed Chinese civilians for sport, much like Russia in Ukraine today. Most of the civilian casualties were Chinese, with between 7 and 8 million killed by the Japanese in mass slaughters, indiscriminate bombardment, or just falling prey to the ravage of war itself. An estimated 200,000 Chinese civilians were killed over 6 weeks in Niamey alone, as the Japanese army turned killing into a contest. The addition of an entire new theater of war skyrocketed the total casualties for the Second World War, but technology would also turn this into the bloodiest conflict in human history. At the onset of World War I, the airplane was a curiosity that most military commanders did not quite know how to deploy. They knew it could make for a handy scout though, and it replaced observation balloons in both armies, giving commanders a true bird's eye view of enemy position for the first time. Information is power, and soon both armies started trying to shoot each other's planes out of the sky. The first aerial duels took place with pistols and achieved very little, but soon machine guns were being loaded onto airplanes as the engines became increasingly powerful. Some enterprising minds saw the potential of the airplane for directly attacking enemy position from the air, and while machine guns were nice, if you really wanted to have an impact on the front, you needed to deliver mass deaths from the sky. Airplane engines were still pretty weak, so the first aerial bombardment weapons were sharpened darts carried aloft by the hundreds and dropped over the fronts. These sharp darts would fall from great distance, and if they scored a hit, would be lethal for a soldier, creating deep, wild wounds that were impossible to stop bleeding. However, the darts were inaccurate, and very few of them actually ever found a target. If a dart missed, like most states, it presented little more than a tripping hazard for enemy soldiers. Grenades were soon be chucked out of the open cockpit of airplanes, but engineers dreamt of more. Bigger airplanes capable of carrying much more bombs, enough to have a significant impact on enemy units. The first bombers could only carry about 55 to 120 pounds of bombs, but some aircraft like the Russian Ilya Muromets could carry as much as 1,500 pounds of bombs. The future was clear. Airplanes would become the most important weapons of the next World War. When World War II broke out, Hitler's army made excellent use of fighter and bomber aircraft as part of their lightning warfare. Pummeling enemy defenses from the air before ground forces arrived helped to soften them up for ground attack. In the specific, Imperial Japan proved that the age of the battleship was at an end when it nearly succeeded in defeating the United States of America in a single strike with aircraft launched via carriers. The airplane allowed massive bomb loads to be carried hundreds, even thousands of miles, and in numbers, the planes could put entire cities under siege. Today, the accepted way of fighting modern war is to engage enemy troops and to destroy military and economically important targets. Civilian populations are off limits, and it's no longer acceptable to target them purposefully as part of your strategy to defeat the enemy. In World War II, the mass slaughter of civilians was the strategy for defeating the enemy. If a civilian population could be eradicated, the economic fallout would make it difficult or impossible to continue prosecuting a war. Mass killing of civilians also demoralized the enemy, prompting nations to sue for peace. In World War II, targeting of cities was not just fair game, but key to success. In the First World War, civilian deaths numbered at around 10 million. Civilian deaths, on the other hand, were twice as high as military deaths at around 50 to 55 million, and the airplane made much of the slaughter possible. During World War I, the artillery piece was the upper limit of how far one could threaten an enemy, typically to a range of a few miles, with most fighting in World War I happening outside of population centers. This put civilians at low risk from direct combat death, with many of the deaths occurring due to the follow-on effects of war, namely starvation and disease. However, in the Second World War, airplanes could threaten cities and entire nation over or even further, and they could bring with them thousands of pounds of bombs, with bomber formations sometimes numbering in the hundreds. Indiscriminate bombing campaigns leveled entire cities, but special types of bombs made the killings much more efficient. Often, cities were targeted with incendiary munitions or bombs designed to create little blast damage and instead fuel mass firestorms. The German city of Dresden was one of the many victims of World War II firebombing and turned the city into a concrete skeleton covered in ash. Incredibly, the city was reduced nearly to rubble in just 3 days, with 3,900 tons of high explosive and incendiary devices dropped on the city by the British Royal Air Force. Such massive devastation in such a short period of time was unheard of in World War I and would have surely shaken both Allied and Central Power commanders to the core. But in the Second World War, the death of 25,000 civilians in 3 days was just par for the course. In the Pacific theater, air raids on civilian cities reached new catastrophic heights. While more civilians died in Europe, Japanese civilians were particularly vulnerable to air raids by the time the strategic bombing campaign of Japan began in 1944. With Japan refusing to surrender, the Allies began to plan an invasion of the Japanese island to weaken Japan for the coming invasion and to attempt to convince the stubborn Japanese into surrender before such an invasion. Unrestricted bombing of the Japanese island was approved. At first, air raids took place against military and industrial targets. However, major Japanese industrial centers were quickly reduced to rubble. By now, front. Japanese forces were so staffed to fill, trained pilots and planes that they couldn't mount much, if any, resistance against air raids. Anti-aircraft guns on the ground were nearly useless as they had difficulty reaching high-flying American B-29. With the loss of major industrial centers, the Japanese dispersed their industrial efforts across their cities to homes and small workshops. This made them much harder to target and neutralize, which prompted the approval of mass bombing of the civilian population. Japanese cities were not just poorly defended from the air but also particularly vulnerable to bombing. Very quickly, the United States realized that using conventional high explosive was not very effective against Japanese cities due to the fact that most buildings were constructed out of wood. High explosives were designed to destroy brick and mortar European cities, but Japanese cities were much more vulnerable to incendiary devices. US bombers began to drop incendiary devices by the thousands over Japanese cities, tackling massive firetombs and razed cities nearly entirely. It wasn't just the massive volume of bombing carried out by the US but also the poor organization of civil defense that led to the massive destruction of Japanese cities and loss of life. Bomb shelters had never been created in large numbers in Japan, and it's unlikely the nation ever believed it could be subjected to the same massive bombing it was carrying out against Chinese cities. Without bomb shelters, civilians had nowhere to shelter from the flames that spanned entire cities, and they were incinerated in the streets. But Japanese firefighters were also poorly trained and equipped for combating blazes, and this led to fires ranging completely out of control with no hope of stopping them. People may remember the nuclear bombs dropped in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but massive aerial campaigns had also dwarfed the killing of the atomic bombs that when news of the total casualties from the bombings reached Imperial Japanese Command, they were mostly unperturbed. They had, after all, already suffered far worse. It was only the realization that a single bomb had caused so much devastation that gave them many pause. On the ground, the development of mobile warfare also helped fuel the massive casualties of World War II. Before World War II, troops moved largely on foot, and this limited both the speed and scope of an advance. Forces couldn't spread out as widely or move as quickly as when warfare became mechanized. The marriage between tanks and mechanized infantry allowed warfare to become much faster and cover much more ground. This in turn meant that more territory could be covered, spreading the scope of the fighting and putting out the civilian population at risk. And nowhere did mobile warfare have as dramatic as impact as the Eastern Front. In the First World War, Russia was defeated relatively early, and the German army did not require an invasion to force its exit from the war. The violence resulted in an estimated 8 to 10 million dead, and many more than that number wounded. In the Second World War, the Eastern Front saw a staggering 40 million dead, about 4 times World War I's figures. The invasion of Russia opened up an entirely new front of the war that had been limited in the First World War, and Hitler's brutal push to Moscow ended up making it the deadliest theater of the war. But Hitler was also busy pumping up his numbers by engaging in one of the greatest atrocities in human history. Hitler dreamt of a pure Europe, one free of any race but the Aryan race, with perhaps a token number of survivors of other races to be used as slave labor. To make his sick fantasy a reality, he initiated wholesale industrial slaughter of anyone he deemed undesirable. To make his list, one only needed to be of another race or an undesirable political ideology or to be disabled. Hitler's dream of a pure Third Reich left no room for anyone who wasn't whole in body and mind, prompting the mass slaughter of individuals with special needs. The best known victims of the Holocaust are the Jewish people, who suffered between 5 and 6 million of their number killed in concentration camps and mass slaughters across Germany and occupied territories. As the German army conquered new lands, they began the systemic removal of all undesirables, heading them into ghettos where they were quarantined until transportation could be arranged to either work camps where they would live as slave labor or to extermination camps. While inside cramped ghettos, they would be walled off from the outside world by barbed wire, armed guards, and often hastily erected consecrate enclosures. Food was sparse, and mass starvation, along with disease, led to the death of many long before the truck and trains arrived. Often, populations would be sorted either before being loaded onto the trains or shortly after. From there, some select deemed healthy or skilled enough would be sent to labor camps to work on German industrial and military goods. The rest, what the Nazis considered human cartel, were marked for extermination and sent directly to their death. This will often happen by instructing prisoners to strip nude and enter massive shower facilities. This was for their own health. They were told, but once they were inside, the doors were locked and all ventilation sealed. A deadly gas was pumped into the room, often causing agonizing death by asphyxiation. Dying inside a Nazi death chamber could take up to 15 minutes, and some even survived after being buried alive by corpses, only to be shot dead by Nazis guards afterward. But while the Jews suffered the most from the Nazis' extermination efforts, they were far from the only populations the Nazis killed and Monsieur. As the Nazis army poured into the Soviet Union, Hitler wanted to wipe out the indigenous population completely so that the Russia could be turned into one giant pure German colony. To that end, he ordered a whopping 5.7 million Soviet civilians be put to death, with many of them simply lined up and gunned down in vast rows. Massive pits would be dug in front of which the Soviet prisoners were lined up, and as machine guns mowed them down, they would fall inside. Then a new row of prisoners would be lined up to meet the same fate. When the pit was near full, the Germans ordered deaths to be spread out over it. The next group to suffer at the hands of the Germans were the Soviet POWs. While the rules of war dictated that POWs were to be treated humanly, and the Germans treated Western POWs relatively well, in the East, German armies engaged in wholesale slaughter of captured Soviet forces. An estimated 2.8 to 3.3 million Soviet POWs were killed during the German invasion. Poland, which had been the first nation to suffer Germans' wrath, also saw up to 3 million of its civilians put to death, as many as 600,000 Serbs, 500,000 Romani, 25,000 Slovenes, and 3,500 Spanish Republicans fighting against Hitler were also exterminated. Hitler's drive to purge undesirables also spread to be disabled both at home in Germany and in occupied territories. Approximately 270,000 disabled people were killed by the Nazis. Political religious ideology was also a reason for extermination, with as many as 200,000 Freemasons exterminated alongside up to 5,000 Jehovah's Witnesses. Hitler also targeted homosexuals in Germany and the territories he conquered, killing as many as 25,000. The wholesale slaughter of entire population is one of the major reasons why the Second World War was far deadlier than the first. For the first time in history, mankind had industrialized mass murder, and had the war lasted longer, these casualty numbers would be astronomically higher. In fact, it was Germany's later troubles in the war that actually prevented even more killing. As war materials began to run short, Germany could no longer afford to transport hundreds of thousands of would-be victims to waiting extermination camps, and the drain on manpower and resources caused by actual fighting spared many from Nazis' killings.